They called him Joe Batters because he preferred to discipline his enemies personally, with a Louisville Slugger baseball bat. Tony Accardo had built his reputation as the most feared man in organized crime by turning violence into an art form, sending messages that were understood by victims and witnesses alike. But on October 8, 1964, in Sammy Davis Jr.'s dressing room at the Copa Room in Las Vegas, Accardo sent the most terrifying message of his career without saying a single word. The gift was simple: a brand new Louisville Slugger baseball bat polished to a mirror shine with a note attached in elegant handwriting. Mr. Davis, a reminder of our previous conversation, use it wisely. TA. But what made grown men weep with terror wasn't the bat itself, it was what was carved into the handle in neat block letters: Sammy's Last Show. This wasn't just a threat. This was Tony Accardo's signature calling card, the same message he had sent to dozens of men before they disappeared forever. And Sammy Davis Jr., the most talented entertainer in America, had 36 hours to figure out what he had done wrong before the bat was used for its intended purpose. To understand the sheer terror that Accardo's gift inspired, you have to understand the man behind the message. Tony Accardo wasn't just another mob boss. He was the undisputed king of American organized crime, the man who had survived 40 years in the most dangerous business on earth by being smarter, more ruthless, and more creative in his violence than anyone else. The nickname Joe Batters had been earned during the bloody Chicago gang wars of the 1930s, when Accardo personally executed at least 25 men with his signature weapon. He didn't just kill them, he made them suffer, breaking bones methodically before delivering the final blow. The sound of Accardo's bat connecting with human skulls had become the stuff of legend in Chicago's underworld. But by 1964, Accardo had evolved beyond simple violence. He understood that the threat of violence was often more powerful than violence itself, especially when dealing with public figures who had reputations to protect. The bat in Sammy's dressing room wasn't meant to be used, it was meant to be feared. The message arrived during the most successful period of Sammy's career. He was headlining at the Copa Room, selling out every show, earning standing ovations from audiences that included movie stars, politicians, and high rollers from around the world. He was also becoming increasingly vocal about civil rights, using his platform to speak out against segregation and racial injustice. And that's what had attracted Tony Accardo's attention. Sammy's dressing room at the Copa Room was his sanctuary, the one place in Las Vegas where he could relax and prepare for performances without interference. The room was always locked when he wasn't there, guarded by hotel security that took their responsibilities seriously, which made the appearance of Accardo's gift even more terrifying. Sammy arrived at the Copa Room on October 8 around 6 p.m., 2 hours before his first show. He unlocked his dressing room door and stepped inside, then stopped dead in his tracks. Sitting on his makeup table, positioned so it would be the first thing he saw, was the baseball bat. The Louisville Slugger was beautiful in its simplicity, professional quality, perfectly balanced, the kind of weapon that could crush a human skull with a single well-placed swing. But it was the note attached that made Sammy's blood turn to ice. Mr. Davis, a reminder of our previous conversation, use it wisely. TA. Sammy stared at the bat for a full minute, his mind racing to understand what he had done to earn Tony Accardo's personal attention. There had been no previous conversation between them, no direct contact, no obvious transgression that would justify this level of threat. Then he noticed the carving on the handle, Sammy's Last Show. The message was clear. This wasn't a warning. It was a death sentence with a delay. Somewhere, somehow, Sammy had crossed a line that Accardo considered unforgivable. And unless he figured out what that line was and made amends immediately, his next performance would indeed be his last. Sammy's first instinct was to call the police, but he quickly realized how futile that would be. Tony Accardo owned half the cops in Las Vegas, and the other half were too terrified of him to get involved. Reporting the threat would accomplish nothing except confirming that Sammy was marked for death. His second instinct was to run, to catch the next plane out of Las Vegas and never look back. But Sammy knew that Accardo's reach extended far beyond Nevada. There was nowhere in America, possibly nowhere in the world, that he could hide from the Chicago outfit if they wanted him dead, which left only one option: figuring out what he had done wrong and finding a way to make it right. Sammy canceled his shows that night, claiming sudden illness. The Copa Room staff was disappointed but understanding. Stars occasionally had health problems that prevented them from performing. They had no idea that their headliner was actually fighting for his life. Instead of performing, Sammy spent the night making phone calls to every contact he had in organized crime, trying to understand why Tony Accardo wanted him dead. The conversations were frustrating and terrifying. Everyone he called was too scared to discuss Accardo openly, speaking in code and half-finished sentences that revealed nothing. Finally, around 3 a.m., Sammy reached Johnny Rosselli, the mob's Hollywood liaison who had always been friendly to entertainers. Rosselli was reluctant to talk on the phone, but he agreed to meet Sammy for breakfast at a diner far from the Strip. The meeting took place at 6 a.m. in a rundown coffee shop that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1940s. Rosselli arrived alone, constantly checking over his shoulder to make sure they weren't being watched. "Sammy," Rosselli said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you've got a serious problem. A serious fucking problem." "What did I do?" Sammy asked desperately. "I've been racking my brain all night, and I can't figure out what." "It's not what you did," Rosselli interrupted. "It's what you're planning to do." The explanation that followed was chilling in its implications. The FBI's surveillance of organized crime had intensified dramatically in recent months, and several high-level mobsters had been arrested based on information that someone had leaked to law enforcement. Tony Accardo had become convinced that there was an informant in his organization, someone with access to sensitive information who was feeding intelligence to the government. And somehow Sammy's name had come up as a possible suspect. "Why would anyone think I'm an informant?" Sammy asked, genuinely confused. Rosselli's answer revealed the paranoid world that Accardo inhabited, where loyalty was constantly questioned and betrayal was assumed to be everywhere. "Your civil rights work," Rosselli explained. "You've been meeting with politicians, talking to reporters, speaking out about racial issues. Accardo thinks you might be trading information about our operations in exchange for political protection." The accusation was absurd. Sammy had never spoken to law enforcement about organized crime activities, had never been approached by the FBI, had never even considered becoming an informant. But in Accardo's paranoid mind, Sammy's political activities made him a potential threat that needed to be eliminated. "How do I convince him he's wrong?" Sammy asked. Rosselli's answer was as chilling as the original threat. "You don't convince Tony Accardo of anything. He's already decided you're a problem. The only question is whether you're going to be a dead problem or a cooperative problem." The solution Rosselli proposed was as humiliating as it was necessary. Sammy would have to publicly distance himself from his civil rights activities, cancel upcoming political appearances, and demonstrate his loyalty to organized crime through a series of increasingly compromising acts. "You need to show him that you're still one of us," Rosselli explained. "Perform at private parties for the families, help with some business operations. Make it clear that you're not talking to the government about anything." The request was devastating for Sammy, who had spent years building his reputation as a serious advocate for civil rights. Being forced to abandon that work to appease a paranoid mob boss was the kind of compromise that would haunt him for the rest of his life. But the alternative was death, and Sammy wasn't ready to die for his principles. Over the next month, Sammy began the painful process of backing away from his political activities. Speaking engagements were canceled. Meetings with civil rights leaders were postponed indefinitely. Statements supporting integration and racial equality became more cautious and less frequent. To outside observers, it looked like Sammy was simply getting tired of political activism and focusing more on his entertainment career. Only a few close friends knew the truth, that he was being forced to choose between his convictions and his life. The most humiliating requirement was Sammy's appearance at a private party hosted by Sam Giancana in Chicago. The event was ostensibly a birthday celebration, but it was really a business meeting disguised as a social gathering. Mob bosses from around the country were in attendance, and Sammy's job was to provide entertainment while they discussed criminal operations. Performing for an audience of killers and criminals was the lowest point of Sammy's career. He sang the same songs that had thrilled legitimate audiences for years, but now they felt like funeral dirges for his own integrity. But the performance served its purpose. By appearing at the party, by entertaining mob bosses while they planned their criminal activities, Sammy demonstrated that he was still a loyal asset rather than a potential informant. The baseball bat remained in Sammy's dressing room for 6 weeks, a constant reminder of how close he had come to death. Finally, in late November 1964, it disappeared as mysteriously as it had appeared, a sign that Tony Accardo had decided Sammy was no longer a threat. But the psychological damage was permanent. The man who had once been fearless in his advocacy for civil rights became cautious and calculating in his public statements. The entertainer who had used his platform to challenge racial injustice became more focused on protecting his own safety than advancing social causes. The baseball bat had accomplished exactly what Tony Accardo intended. It had broken Sammy's spirit without breaking his body, turning a potential enemy into a compliant asset through the simple application of terror. When Tony Accardo died in 1992, Sammy Davis Jr. had been dead for 2 years. But the terror that Accardo had inspired with his gift in 1964 had lasted for the rest of Sammy's life, a constant reminder that even the most successful entertainers were just one paranoid suspicion away from becoming targets of organized crime violence. The baseball bat with Sammy's Last Show carved into the handle became a legend in mob circles, a perfect example of how Tony Accardo could control people through fear rather than force. It demonstrated that the most effective threats were often the most subtle. The most terrifying messages were sometimes the ones that were never explicitly delivered. For Sammy Davis Jr., the bat represented the end of his political innocence and the beginning of a more cautious phase of his career. He had learned that in America, even the most talented entertainers were vulnerable to the whims of violent men who operated outside the law. But perhaps most importantly, the bat had taught him that integrity was a luxury that only those with nothing to lose could afford. And as long as he had a career to protect and a life to preserve, Sammy would have to compromise his principles to survive in a world where organized crime and legitimate business were often indistinguishable. The gift from Tony Accardo had been perfectly calculated to achieve its goal, turning a potential threat into a compliant asset without the messy complications that came with actual violence. And in that sense, it had been the most effective weapon in Accardo's arsenal, not because it could kill, but because it could control.